All right. Hello, sister.
Hello, sister.
We didn't say, hey, sister, like we normally do. um, so I'm really excited because we've been on the journey for the past week and a half, and I'm excited to kind of digest that further with you and with our audience as well. So if this is your first time kind of meeting us, I'm Justine.
Sorry. Oh.
Sorry, you've been missing out. No. I'm Justine, and I'm here with my sister Kara. We both host a great podcast called the Sunflower Society Podcast, and we are founders of Spiritually Strategic Co. And we felt led. It was mainly for our own purposes. It was almost kind of like our own little Bible study and unpacking our journey and our faith, where we've been and where we are now. And it's been really refreshing to do that through this series called Losing My Religion. And we were pretty intentional about that title because we have had so many different experiences in quote unquote the church, multiple denominations, multiple ways that has looked in our lives. And so we thought we'd get to the root of it, but also put ourselves out there to really model that the Bible in particular, which we both believe and read. Well, let me now speak for Kara. Maybe, I don't know if there's parts you do or don't believe, but I believe the Bible. We grew up in the church. And so if you haven't tuned into the first 6 episodes, you probably want to pause this. I know you're tempted to stay here and hang out with us, but you probably want to pause this and go start at the first episode. They're each pretty short. This one is longer because we're wrapping things up and bringing it all together. But we thought, what if we actually put ourselves out there to unpack that two people literally with the same DNA who grew up in the same household with the same parents,
The same churches.
Same churches until we were 18. What if we both demonstrate and model how differently we interpret scripture? So still on today, when we're filming this last episode right now, neither of us has watched each other's videos. And
I watched some of yours, but not before I recorded my own.
No, I'm kidding. Okay, I haven't. I watched my own afterwards. But we both started with the first couple episodes just giving a little backstory to upbringing and journey and faith in the church. And then we took turns dissecting 2 women in the Bible that you really don't hear much about. And we did that partially too because we started seeing a very concerning trend in that we kind of live in this day and age where we've all gotten very good, if you've been part of the Christian faith or a church in the United States in particular, we've gotten really good at regurgitating certain passages of scripture. But maybe not necessarily stepping back and going outside of Sunday morning church. Why do I believe what I believe? Why do I feel confident in what I believe? And do I really know how to study the Bible and unpack the scriptures and how then I apply that to my life? Or am I waiting to attend a church service and let the pastor do all that heavy lifting and then tell me what he or she thinks is right or wrong? More times than not, let's be honest, it's a he. So that's kind of a background as to why we're doing this, and we're going to continue to converse with each other about unpacking into our adulthood what that looks like, and how we are now here and continuing to deconstruct our faith. So Kara, that was a really long intro, but I wanted to give background context before we just dove in. Do you want to introduce yourself or kind of kick things off? I know you posted a very interesting cryptic post on Instagram this morning. If you don't follow her, she's at Fawn River Beauty. I'm at Spiritually Strategic. But you posted a cryptic post. I don't know if you want to start with that.
You think it was cryptic?
I mean, it could be, or people could be like, a piece of fabric. That's
Well,
okay. That's okay if you see our posts and you're like, yeah, I have no idea what that is. Is that lingerie? Oh my.
this is head lingerie right here. I.e., it looks like a doily, but I do have stories about this. And then I also have our great grandmother's covering. She was part of the Mennonite Church when she was still alive.
I have one of them as well. It's in my storage unit in Chicago.
Yep. I brought these as visual aids for today's conversation. Before I get into that story, I wanted to just say another step to our deconstruction journey, which we can talk a little bit more about what that even is, but has been amplified drastically for me anyway. I would say probably for you too, but again, I won't speak for you. But with this whole pandemic that we're experiencing, and some of the protests regarding Black Lives Matter and racism and systemic racism in the United States, and all of those things kind of happening at once. I've been in this deconstruction journey, and I'll tell you a bit more about the start of that for me, which was about almost 20 years ago now. But during this time when I fully expected to see people coming together in unity, because we are, like, in my mind, which is limited to its own experience, of course, but in my mind, I'm thinking, I remember 9/11. I remember how everybody reacted and responded during that time. And it did feel like a certain, like, we didn't have sides. We were all America. We were sort of like in it together. We were grieving. We were, I guess social media wasn't such a thing back then. I don't even know that.
We were also still teenagers, because I had just begun my sophomore year when that happened. No, you would have been 19, I think.
I think I don't know. I was close to 20, 19, 20-ish.
Yeah.
Whatever. But I was in college, and I remember that time being a time of unity. Not that going to war, that's a whole other conversation. But so when we're experiencing this thing that we've never seen in our lifetime, this strange feeling and aura in the air kind of, that's happening, and you're seeing, and instead of the people that are supposed to be responding in love and unity, who have been trained up in the ways of God, the church, I've actually seen this whole trend of, especially the evangelical church, of people having these very, like, outlierish beliefs and values, conspiracy theories, none of which point back to the love of God. And I would say,
or really even the Bible,
or anything to do with what it means to have a relationship with God, which is, if you say you're a Christian, this is really confusing, right? And I'm looking at it from the lens of, I've gone to church my whole life up until about 5 years ago. I know the church, and I know what I was taught, and I know that some of those things I still choose to keep in my life because they're valuable. The biggest of which is love God, love others, which is what Jesus came to earth to tell us about. But when you see an entire institution breaking away from a message of love and community, you also have to pause and say, so are we the dividers on the outside of the church, or are you actually the instigators of division by the things that you're propping up right now? Which is, to me, in a lot of regards, anti-love, anti-unity, and at the very minimum, which is still incredibly harmful, there's no empathy there. And part of loving other people is the ability to empathize. And when you're not willing to even look inward and say, am I part of the problem? Which is what I see kind of across the board with a lot of people. I mean, there are a lot of people like Justine and I that are saying, no, stop. I want no part of this label, which is, for me, that's important to differentiate. I'm not coming to you today as a person that is saying I'm part of the evangelical church because I denounce that. And I don't know if that's offensive to some people, but I don't want to be associated with that until, or if, it moves back onto the track of actually loving other people, because that is not what is going on right now.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I don't know where I was going with that.
Well, you were bringing into why you've been challenged to highlight your journey of faith deconstruction in the midst of all the emotions of the pandemic because of what you're seeing with the church. So can you take us back? Because I haven't watched your video. So if y'all, a very, very quick snippet in both of our videos, I mean, just short notes until we were each on our own at 18, like pretty much out, like moved out of the home, except in the summers from college. But that would be mainly in the Baptist church and then the evangelical church. So I was very involved in youth group. Kara was not. I latched onto it because I have a believer personality. Like if you give me some Kool-Aid that agrees with me, I'm going to drink it. And so for those of us who have that strong personality, it can also be very harmful, right? And so one of our background caveats, again, if you haven't tuned into our podcast or these videos or our channel here, whatever, our father's Puerto Rican. Our mother has background. When we say she has a background in the Amish Mennonite faith, we have relatives that are still actively Amish, still actively Mennonite, and our grandparents left the Amish church. So that's deeply embedded as part of our heritage. And I know you had gone off to college. I'm still over here, you know, doing youth praise band and every youth group I can attend in the county. And you're off at college, right? Yeah. So do you want to pick up that journey? Because, and I have to publicly apologize because I also if you know me, you know I can be ornery and I can be an instigator. Even as an adult still, it's part of who I am. I'm okay with it. But
you come from a whole family.
I would make fun of Kara to no avail because I did not understand. And I didn't try to. I think honestly, that was probably the most strained our relationship probably ever was, to be honest, if I really think about it, because you had gone off into this other world. We were no longer in the same high school. Even when we were active in some of the same things, but also very different worlds. You were a senior doing your own thing. I was a freshman. But you had gone off to college. And so I was able to start to establish more of my own identity in high school and not just Kara's little sister. So that was also like, for me, I latched onto a lot of those things. I was involved in a lot of things, but I was looking at it like, where did this come from? Like, we didn't grow up Mennonite. We didn't ever go to a Mennonite church. What is going on? And then I would make fun of you. I really did. And I chastised you a lot. And yeah, so I publicly apologize. Well, I apologize personally to you. But it also shows, I'm sharing that because vulnerability wise, I wasn't being a good sister, but I also didn't know any better. And I think that that's important to point out because I was so heavy into the evangelical world. And I talk about this in my video. You can go back if you want to hear about it. I mean, I was going to Purity Day. I was all in on I Can Stating Goodbye. Like, it was a lot. And so I highlight that to say that even in my youngness, I had been indoctrinated very, very heavily. that anything that wasn't that, what's that? And it doesn't matter if I was trying to look down on somebody or not, it was going to be judgmental. When in fact, Kara and I grew up loving and knowing and experiencing the same God, literally with the same DNA. So I'm prefacing all that and apologizing too, because we often, when you are so in the church, you have no idea how you're viewing other people, and you've already compartmentalized them to less than your way of believing. They're somehow less than, or what they believe, that's not quite right. That's weird. That's different. But yet we were both still claiming to be Christians.
Right.
So, okay. Just wanted to say that.
I think when I look back, like that, it was right around my between sophomore and junior year of college. And I had been, been in a position in my faith where I attended a state college for a couple of years, and I was doing the party thing and having a fun time, but I was also going to Campus Crusade for Christ, as often as I could.
Why?
I was attending.
Why were you still going?
Well, because I still had a relationship with God. I mean, I didn't feel like, morally speaking, I didn't feel like my lifestyle choices were necessarily bad enough. I'll say that about a lot of different choices that I made that were contrary to what I learned in the church. And I think I said this at some point in a recent podcast episode, maybe, or I don't know, but I didn't feel guilty about my lifestyle choices. What I felt guilty about was trying to hide them from my Christian friends, because I knew that I would be heavily judged. It wasn't that within myself I had been convicted that I was going down the wrong path. I feel like that was a great time of freedom and exploration for me. But I didn't think that I needed to let anybody know about it. And so my biggest regret during that time was not being who I was, because I really wasn't. I kind of was, because I was doing the things I wanted to do, but I also was hiding it and lying about it. And so it wasn't because I felt it was bad for me. I felt that I would be judged and shunned in a way. And that is the case. I mean, it is the case. You make certain lifestyle choices that aren't within a denominational doctrine, then you're out. I mean, you either have to comply or you don't go.
You're not one of the cool kids.
You can go. I mean, you can go sit and you can listen, but the actual involvement, you can't. So, and that wasn't my relationship with God.
Right.
So I remember distinctly doing a study on Corinthians, 1 Corinthians, with one of my Bible study women's groups. And we came across this verse that talks about women covering their head in church. And at that point,
some translations say during worship, correct?
Right. But the translation, yeah. But it's also interpreted like, for example, Amish and conservative Mennonites wear coverings on their head because they believe they're always supposed to be in active worship to God, and it's not just on Sundays when you go to church.
Correct.
So I know our great grandma didn't wear her covering during the week, but when they went to church on Sundays, she wore her head covering. Prior to that, earlier in their marriage, when they were still part of the Amish church, obviously, they did everything Amish. And then when they went to conservative Mennonite, she did wear it, from what I understand through story, daily for a period of time, but then gradually moved away from that.
There's pictures of her too with it on.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So that being said, we are from a family of dissenters, or heretics, if you will, because that is a big step.
Go figure.
That's a big step, and it's kind of been a story in our what do you call it? Genealogy, not genealogy. You know You know what I'm trying to
Oh,
say?
it is. It's to me, I always tell people being a disruptor is truly part of my DNA.
Yeah.
Our mother marrying our father was an active disruption for the time period. Okay.
Yeah.
Prior to that,
our grandmother marrying
our grandfather, who was one of 27 children in Puerto Rico, coming to Chicago at the age of 16, I don't think barely knowing how to read or having much education, was a disruptor. Our grandfather, leaving the Amish church, also rising up throughout a factory with barely an 8th grade education, was a disruptor. Our grandparents leaving the Amish faith were disruptors, right? So we have from all angles. Sometimes it just makes me laugh. Like, even looking back, if we had people in our family who questioned certain decisions we make, and this is not to call, if anybody's listening, it's not to call anybody out, and it's not bad. It's just funny to me that when you actually look at the story that's been paved before you, let's use an Amish metaphor, the quilt that's been created, the mosaic of the quilts that's been created, it makes a whole lot of sense why that's part of the spirit of who people are.
Right. And who would we be today if we would not have continued that story for our families? You know, I don't believe I wouldn't be doing the work I'm doing with my faith journey if I were Amish right now, probably. I mean,
Right.
maybe I would,
Right.
maybe I would, but I'd be in a whole different. I could hypothetically.
No, you wouldn't. We wouldn't be on YouTube.
Oh yeah, we wouldn't exist.
We wouldn't have phones. We would not have any of this.
But we wouldn't exist either because our mother would have never married a Puerto Rican man.
There we go.
No,
Okay.
Yeah. So it doesn't even matter. Back to what I was saying. So my deconstruction journey, deconstruction is just some kind of terminology that's used for what I'm doing or what you're doing. And it's just basically taking things step by step. You can check out my Instagram highlights. I have a whole tab on deconstruction. I have some information there, but it's taking every belief that you have, which I found necessary during this time, this pandemic, especially because it's like, if I'm going to be speaking and advocating for people, I better know my shit. Like, I better know.
Yeah.
I'm not just going to latch onto a side for the sake of latching onto the side. I need to, within my own spirit and within my own relationship with God, figure out like what is the right way to approach this that can impact for good and for love the biggest number of people. Right. My intention is not to bring division whatsoever, although I know some people probably look at this as like, well, these girls are, heretics or whatever it is, which heretics, I had to look up the actual definition of heresy, and it's basically an opinion profoundly at odds with what is generally accepted. And
that sums up my entire life experience.
Same.
Don't put me in a box.
Contrary, to what people may think of our intention in doing all this, sharing all this or whatever, really at the core of it, we are becoming more free in our faith journey with God and seeing fruit of that in our lives, and just want to give people, and especially women, permission to start asking questions, because we grew up in a faith that was very restrictive to women, and I really didn't even see it that way until the last few years. I didn't know. I thought there was something really wrong with me, actually, because there were a lot of things that I believed, quote unquote, but they were dissonant to what I actually knew to be right in my life. And so there was a disconnect.
I still remember into the 90s, our mother was not allowed, air quotes, to wear slacks to church.
Right.
I also remember being a little kid and like having to wear tights with our dresses and I freaking hated it. Because tights never fit you correctly if you have a big old butt, okay? I'm just here to tell you. Okay, sorry. No, I hated it. They would always sag in the crotch, and I'm sorry. I just remember, like, I hated wearing tights. I didn't hate going to Sunday school, but I hated the way that I had to dress. Okay, sorry.
So I was studying this First Corinthians, and it talks about the headship, which is basically the idea that it's kind of complicated, but that a man is the direct line to God, and that a man and a woman are supposed to marry. He's supposed to have dominion over her, and she is supposed to be submissive to him, so that she can basically through him have a pathway of righteousness to God. That also goes along with a whole lot of like doctrinal weirdness in a lot of cases.
Is it supposedly tied to the redemption of Eve being the original sinner and femininity ultimately leading to
the fall of man?
The fall. Yeah. Okay. Right. And it was a woman's fault that Adam decided to also eat the forbidden fruit because it was a woman who tempted him. Is that kind of the crux of it? Of why it's delineated that way? I'm just asking what you think. It's okay if theologically you don't know for sure or haven't studied, but to me, that would be the typical thought process of to why it's tied. That no, ultimately, a man is the way of a woman back to God.
It's more. I think it's more that that woman was created from man.
Okay.
And so that is the natural course of things. That woman was created of man, and so because she was created from him and not from the dust like Adam was, she's here and he's here.
Got
because
it.
She's so anyways, Paul's talking about it in First Corinthians, and I read this and is like this one verse stuck out, and it says, and every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, which is her husband or God if she's not married. It is just as though her head were shaved. If a woman does not cover her head, she should have her hair cut off. And if it's a disgrace for a woman to have her hair cut off, she should cover her head. And I read this and I was like, wait a minute. We're in the New Testament. I don't go to a church.
Paul's the author.
Paul's the author. And I don't go to a church. I know that in our history, in our family history, that was a thing for a woman to cover her head in church. But we didn't grow up in a church. You know, we had to wear dresses, but we didn't grow up in a church that just cover our head in worship even on Sunday.
Right.
We were allowed to cut our hair in the Baptist church. So it was it was like it was a pivotal moment because I was like, I either have to believe all of this because it says here in the New Testament, and I was told that the New Testament is infallible, and then I'm supposed to believe everything in it because, hey, they pull verses about homosexuality from the New Testament and say that we have to follow these, even though, you know, culturally that is unsound right now in our where we are in our evolution as humans. We also know that they talk a lot about things that we don't, you know, we pick and choose. We really do, but yet we say we come back to the infallibility of the Bible constantly because it's the Word of God. We're supposed to be following to the letter everything that it says. Well, when I started looking at this, I started asking questions. I started doing research. I actually spent hours in the library at my school trying to find information on this because I didn't really have access at the time to anybody that was currently practicing this, but I was so confused by the whole thing.
Right.
And I happened to be working. I worked at a cosmetics counter of all things at this time. in this time when I was like questioning everything about my modesty and my whether I should be wearing makeup or wearing earrings or all of these things, because there's verses that say you're not supposed to adorn yourself and blah, 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 blah. Go ahead. What are you going to say?
You must have converted and like fully started wearing a covering all the time after my first date. So I just want to share this really quick because you were like, I haven't told this story, but my first date ever was, because I would have been 16 and you were 20. So no, I'm wrong. I would have been 17 and you were 21. It would have had to. No, you're 3 years older. 17 and 20. Okay, I digress. But my first date ever in life was a double date with Kara. So it's also kind of weird now that I think about it. Like both of them had to have known who we were and been like watching us or stalking us. Because
I worked with him at Alder.
I know. But when he asked you out, he was like, "Oh, do you want to have your sister come and my brother will come too?" Like he had a younger brother. And I knew I had heard of that guy. Like I'd heard about him. Yeah. So we go to the movies on a double date. It's my first date ever in life, and which I would not have it any other way because it really sums up Kara and I's friendship and sisterhood and beautiful relationship. But I remember going to the bathroom before it was during the movie. I went to the bathroom. She came with me. And this dude, the little brother, I mean, they were both decent looking, but he had like started rubbing my pinky. He didn't just put my hand and hold it. He was rubbing my pinky. And I was like, is that not? Because clearly I'd never gone on a date, hadn't kissed anybody at that point. Look, purity day, remember?
Yeah, he was trying to avoid touching your purity ring.
I guess. Ring. My precious. So we're in the bathroom and she's just dying laughing and I'm super embarrassed. Like, this is weird. And we go to a coffee shop afterwards and Kara and I end up like just cackling and telling all these ridiculous stories. And we were basically having more fun with each other. I think both of the brothers were like, this is a whole lot of energy. We don't really know because we definitely never went out with them again. So that's that. Oh, I shouldn't say that. No, I did go on a couple dates with just the brother who is my age. Anyways, I share that. Yeah, I went out with him a couple more times, but I just wasn't really like, he had been homeschooled. He worked at a body shop and like he was done with school.
You didn't have a lot in common.
We didn't have a lot in common. He was super nice, super sweet, but I just wasn't really that into him.
It is what it is.
Yeah. There wasn't much conversation, right? So seemingly on paper, we'd be the perfect Christian couple, but no, I just didn't feel a whole lot of excitement about him.
Anyways,
no, I say that all to say you must have had your conversion right after that.
I wouldn't call it a conversion. I was experimenting for sure.
Okay.
It's actually it doesn't embarrass me anymore, but for a long time it really embarrassed me. Like I didn't tell my husband about this phase of my life until after we were married.
Was that heightened embarrassment because I used to like chastise you to no avail?
I mean, no, it was just embarrassing because in a lot of ways, when I was wearing a covering on my head, I was calling more attention to myself.
That's true.
Than I was if I had had my boobs out and.
That's true.
You know, tons of makeup and whatever, because it was so
Kara,
different.
You can't just go salsa dancing with a covering on. I'm just kidding.
I definitely didn't.
I know. I know.
But that's the thing. When I was in this period of time, and it was only for probably 6 months of time, maybe, I had gotten invited to come to this church by they were conservative Mennonite, and they came to the makeup counter, and I struck up a conversation with them, and it was during the time that I had been like, you know, questioning things, and I was asking them about where they go to church because they didn't have the white, like regular conservative Mennonite covering, they had like the little black doily covering, which I know within that hierarchy it is more progressive Mennonite.
Correct. Can you show both again
Mennonite.
so that people can see the difference?
So this is what our grandma wore, and she was a member of a plain church conservative Mennonite, whatever you want to call it. It's very close to Amish. They could drive a car, but my
And
grandma always
they don't have
grandma
restrictions on their color of clothing. So if you go one notch above that to beach
Right.
Amish, they can only drive black cars, I believe, and only wear dark colored clothing.
Yeah.
That I think.
Well,
I could be wrong.
I think the clothing thing is it's so there's so many. It's just like the evangelical church, though. There's so many different. It's like little neighborhoods and pockets of people that have come together and said, "Hey, like I grew up this way, but actually we don't like the idea that we can't have rubber on our tires, so we're going to convert from Amish to conservative Mennonite so that we can have a telephone, electricity."
It's picking and
drive
choosing.
a car.
It's picking and choosing at its finest.
Yeah. So anyway, so this is the one that I was gifted by these girls, and
wait, they gave it to you at the makeup counter?
No.
Oh
no. I got invited to the church, and I just went, and I was the only one. I went with them, like a couple weeks from when we met, and I went with them, and I was the only one in the congregation that didn't have one on. And talk about feeling like you stick out like a sore thumb. So I asked somebody, I said, you know, if I really liked it, I mean, I felt welcomed and everything. So I said, if I keep coming back, where do I get one of these? Like, do I need to wear one of these?
Is there a vending machine in your lobby?
You don't just buy one.
That's a good point. What if we were exploring churches and wow, that's a really good point. It really is like a clique. It's like having a Letterman's jacket in high school.
Yeah, with a different meaning to it.
Well, no, of course, but like if you go, you know, that would be a question, like that would turn up so many people away because that alone would be scary enough. Number one, you stick out like a sore thumb. And then number two, it's like, yeah, I don't even know where to buy something like that.
Yeah. So they gave me one and I wore it, and I first just started wearing it on Sundays because, well, my family was having a fit about it because they didn't understand. And I kept saying, like, well, you believe the whole Bible, right? It says right here, like I'm showing you what it says. And then you go over another chapter and you're talking about spiritual gifts. You believe all that, but you don't actually, well, no, it was culturally relevant for the time, is what I kept being told.
Ooh,
and
bingo,
the reason that we move away from that is because we know we have grace. We know we're given grace through salvation. Right. And so we don't need to be performative. That's very performative. What is that? I don't remember who it was in our family, and I wouldn't call them out anyway, but call it a sin sifter. So you think you're holier because you have a sin sifter on your head? Was that you?
No, I've never even heard that. It does sound very witty, but no, I can't take credit for that because I've never even heard that.
So basically, the implication that
I think you probably had more arguments and debates with mom and dad. I think I might have taken probably jabs at you, but I don't remember us actually having conversation about like your beliefs or the theology of it.
Right. So it was just
do you?
I don't. No.
Okay.
The crux of it, I'm not going to go too much more into that journey, but I started wearing it more and getting the same weird responses. So I was like, I don't really know what I'm supposed to do right now because I'm trying to do the right thing. I'm trying to like do what I have what I found in scripture, because I was trying to live in a very black and white way. And I think, I mean, looking back on it, probably because I needed some kind of security or stability during that time in my life. And this, for whatever reason, made it feel like since I was doing the right things in my life, because I stopped, drinking alcohol. I stopped dancing, which was like a huge sacrifice for me.
Right. Like you
I
were an actual dancer.
I
So
was an active.
audience, is this your first time engaging? Kara like actually was a dancer. I don't mean like at a strip club.
Not at a strip club.
Yeah. I mean,
I'm not
like,
shaming women
you
that do, but
you were like in
I
7th
was,
grade.
yeah.
And you loved it. It wasn't just that you got into salsa dancing when you were an adult.
It was the only way that I felt free in my body to express myself, and it just felt really good. I love makeup. I stopped wearing makeup for a period of time. So I felt like I was needing to sacrifice all these things about myself in order to get to this place where I was following the Bible as it was written as best as I knew how to do.
Right.
And I fully intended to continue on that journey, except the people that, just like today with the pandemic, the people who were supposed to love me through that and see me through that and be okay and accepting, because I still love the same God that they love. It's just a different interpretation maybe than what they follow in their own lives. I got the most ridicule. And it wasn't just within our family, it was friends as well, so I just stopped. I quit. I like, when I look back on all the churches that I've been to and tried, I loved that church family. I got invited into people's homes every Sunday. I was single at the time, so I got invited into people's homes for dinner. Like, it was lovely. I had people actually checking in on me during the week. It was very nice. Like, and a family. It was that actual church family, which I say that because I have never felt that way in another place before, but there was such dissonance with what I had grown up with and then what I was experiencing. I'm just like, it's just not worth it at a certain point. Right. So I got away from it. I struggled in my relationship with God then for, I don't know, years after that. But I would say that marks my beginning.
I would call those like wandering years, right? Like, the wandering years.
Yeah.
And probably, honestly, when I look back at this timeline and some things I'm about to share, we were probably going through that at the same time.
Wow.
Which is interesting. We're 3 years apart, listeners or viewers, audience, people, humans. So, because then your focus, though, quickly became your marriage and your kids.
Right.
And you were working. So,
right.
What time did you have at that point then to also really commit to, well, yeah, I'm going to study theology and I'm actually going to ask the tough questions.
What it ended up being translated into was service. So I went on a couple long-term mission trips. I served in the church. I started attending a different church and it was more evangelical. I started working in the children's ministry there and also in a mentorship program. And then that translated in my nursing career and just being really devoted to, I would pick up extra hours whenever I could, not for the money, but because I was like, okay, I'm gonna help my coworkers. I'm gonna be there and be available. And then I want to be there for our community and service.
I think it's important to note that you use the term service for those quote unquote missions trip, because also that can have a negative connotation as to indoctrination and proselytizing. And it's important to note that when you were in Romania, you were serving in orphanages.
Right.
You were truly there to help out. When you were in the Dominican Republic, you were there to learn about being a nurse and to serve and help out. And
I was in an orphanage there too for like a month and a half.
Right.
And I was
And
doing dishes and
you
feeding them
lived
meals
with
and
families, like you. So I think that's also important to note, because that also can have a negative kind of triggering connotation for many people. That, so did you go to this city or this country because you felt that this might rehash these whole concepts of slavery? But that's how
so
slavery began,
that
right?
was
The
where
word was
my
weaponized to say we need to go help these people, and then they were dehumanized. And there
so
could still
that was
be
that
that air with missionaries of like, I need to go fix this population, instead of let me go understand and connect and create empathy with this population to be relevant to serve in their needs through
right,
my gifts.
right, because that's how people see God through you, right? So if we're going to go somewhere, we don't know the actual people that we're going to be working with. For me to sit there and be like, Jesus is love. Jesus came to save you from your sins. I don't have a connection with you. So what does that mean to you? If I go in and I'm doing your dirty laundry and I'm changing dirty poop diapers and I'm doing dishes and I'm, feeding sick babies and I'm doing these things, eventually you're going to see there's something different about this person, because we don't get this kind of help from like an everyday run of the mill person. What's inside of her that she wants to do this for us,
Right.
and that's where the conversation starts. I didn't have an experience with like, it wasn't a short-term mission trip, so I felt like we actually did build relationships with the people that we were working with.
Right.
And it wasn't for the express purpose of talking about God. It was for especially the second trip that I did in the Dominican for 3 months. That was it was called SST, which is study service term. I don't remember.
Yeah.
But I went to, for the rest of my education, I went to a Mennonite school, and that was part of their requirements for your learning. And I'm so thankful that I had that experience. But we were immersed in the culture. We learned the language. We had to speak the language. I was on my own essentially for 3 months. I mean, we came back together as a group, once in a while, but I was on my own for a lot of it. And it really showed me a lot of, like, I had to be deep with God during that time, because first of all, I didn't know the language that well. And I had a host family that didn't.
Rubia.
Yeah. Yeah. And just navigating and feeling even safe, like in some of the places that I was walking by myself, or like I'm the only white girl with, white skin in the neighborhood, and like I'm for sure looking American right now. And just some of those kind of things where I did feel like that was when I started to get more in connection with God again, because I went to a few Catholic churches services while I was there, and a couple evangelical services, all in Spanish. But it was like, because I didn't understand the language entirely, it was more about the beauty of seeing, or like being in presence of God, than the actual content of the message or
Right.
whatever. So that was invaluable. But I don't think, I don't know. I didn't feel super. I've always been connected to God and the Holy Spirit, but for some reason, the church the last few years has been like almost like sucking that away from me when I've been involved. And so for me to separate myself from it, I've never had a more clear picture of what it means to love other people, and also to serve people where their needs are. And it's not for me to decide what their needs are, and it's also not for me to decide how they got to that need, like if there was some kind of sin in their life.
Right.
So for me, this whole process of figuring out what's important about this belief, fundamentally, and what is it helping or hurting other people? Is it helping or hurting me? What does the Bible actually say about this? What did Jesus actually say? Does he even talk about it? So sorry, I went on for a long tangent. You were going to start sharing.
No, look, there's no time limit on this. It's our final one, right? We're wrapping it all together. Did you want to share anything else? This is so funny. It's not even funny. It's just interesting that how we're breaking this down. And I'm thinking of these timelines, and I'm going to share things that like you might not even know about me, because we were kind of in our own worlds, right? And I think in your 20s, that is somewhat to be expected. If you move out of your parents and you're on your own, if you get married, right, like, I guess maybe that's short-sighted of me to assume that. I don't know, because maybe there are a lot of people watching this who they married someone from their hometown, they lived in their hometown, they haven't had a whole lot of other experiences, and that's okay. But that's our other hope with this, is to share what our worlds were like, and that everybody has a unique story if you choose to examine it in that way. Just like when you read the Bible, you have to examine and digest what it means for you. And so when I look back at that, and I shared in my video a story about my undergrad experience, and already I had shifted denominations multiple times because we grew up mainly Baptist, in multiple Baptist churches, mind you, multiple different ones. And I thought of another story, but I'll table to share that, because I went on my first quote unquote service trip when I was 15. And I was already working, so I think I helped pay for it. I think mom said I had to like pay for half of it or something. I don't remember exactly. But for me, that was actually pivotal, because we went and I got to serve at preschools in Washington, D.C. And I loved it. Like, I was like, I want to be in the city, and I know I want to teach already. This is it. Like, I already had that experience, and I knew that's where I felt at home. That's where I felt comfortable. And so I tell a story. So go back to my episode 2, I think it is, in the series, if you want to hear more about what it was like going to a Wesleyan tradition. That was my undergrad experience. I had actually chosen that. Kara might not know this. I had chosen it based on, namely, I had been researching. Again, you can tell we're both nerds, and our mom raised us to read and research things. But I was researching the most rigorous elementary education programs, okay? So I didn't want to just go to any school, and I didn't want to choose a school based on, oh, it's the party capital, oh, it's this or that, or frats, or so. No, we were paying for our own. We're first generation college grads. We worked our tails off. Like, no, if I'm going to get the best. And they had one of the most rigorous programs because they had multiple practicum experiences. Like, it was experiential learning. So if you notice, right, that's a trend with me with different things. I like to learn by doing and being immersed in it. So had that experience, graduate early, moved to Indianapolis. I actually, when I first moved down there, and Kara went to church with me because she came to visit. My first church I attended there was Presbyterian. Again, and I'm just unpacking my thought process. So, if you're tuning into this, don't feel like you have a crazy story. It's not a competition, and we're truly just sharing our thought process and unpacking this. Everybody has very unique experiences. So hopefully that we're sharing very transparently. You don't feel bad or weird if you've had a lot of different experiences in your life, or if you question things, or if you're trying to understand maybe people who think differently than you. This is why, right? If you've always been in the same church your whole life, or the same type of tradition, hopefully this also sheds light on why we talk about the things we do, not because we're not followers of Christ and followers of God, but because part of your life is examining, why do I believe what I believe? Why am I living the way I'm living? So I selected that church namely because, again, I love the city. And it was a super cool church. It was close to downtown. Like, there is no good reason other than I liked that there was liturgy. I had never been part of a congregation that has liturgy. It was super like folksy and artsy, and I'm 22, I'm new to the city, and there was really no good reason. Like, there wasn't. And I didn't ever take it. The funny thing is, for as much as we tried, like, we were kind of in either evangelical or Baptist, and then having the Wesleyan experience in undergrad, I never was super tied to a specific denomination. Like, I was kind of like, as long as they're teaching from the Bible and they got good praise and worship, I'm good. Because I can talk with anybody, I can figure out how to connect with anybody pretty much. Right. So Presbyterian church, I enjoyed it. I felt like I did have a family. I was single, got involved and got invited to people's houses. Like, it was a great experience. I switched churches when I got set up on a blind date by one of my friends and ended up becoming engaged to the guy. And his father was actually a bishop in the Anglican church. So Anglican and Presbyterian can be somewhat correlated, but Anglican is probably more closely associated with the Catholic tradition, to be honest, just in some of the rituals and things. That was an interesting experience. For multiple reasons. It wasn't the most solid relationship, another episode for another day, but it was also highly legalistic. And it was also in a tradition where, he was from a different country, which I learned and knew and loved and still love so much about the culture. But it was also an experience that I didn't look like pretty much anybody else in the congregation. But I love the praise and worship. I think actually Dad went to church with me when he came and visited one time, and he loved it. But there's also a lot of African influence, very different experience, but it was very religious still. And there was also pressures because, well, at the time, my future father-in-law was a head bishop in Nigeria. So there's all those pieces. Called off my wedding 3 days before it, realized and literally had a moment in the middle of the night where I'm like on my knees crying in my bathroom of my apartment, and I hear literally a voice say, "You don't have to do this." Like I said, whole other backstory for another day, and God has healed so much. And Kara played a pivotal role because actually that's when I started to actually understand and realize that people who really love you tell you the truth. And I hadn't really had anybody else do that in my life, and except Kara, and I was really pissed at her at the time. But she was telling me things that I was not aware of about my relationship, and I'm forever grateful for that, and I hope you know that. But after that, I literally Googled. I
have to give kudos to my husband also on that one, because I was talking to him about, I don't want to like ruin her. Like, she's getting married in a few days. How can I even bring this up? And he said, you have to tell her you love her. So tell her.
See, guys make it sound so simple sometimes.
But it really did push me. Yeah. It pushed me to do it. So.
Well, and you knew I was like, there were so many layers too that you didn't even know at the time. Now you know, and like, you were spot on. Both of you were. So I appreciate y'all. But, anyways, after that, right, I'm like, well, obviously I can't go back to church there. So I'm literally, but I still knew I needed a church. I was still very much like, that's a non-negotiable. I'm going to be in a church. So I literally Googled churches in Indianapolis. And that's how I found my next church, which I would actually be involved with for like 5 years. They were actually connected to the Vineyard. I still don't quite understand that denomination. I think it's tied to the evangelical church. I don't know. It's some type of denomination, but it's Bible-based. They were very open and accepting. I just remember going there the first time, and it was just very different. Like, we were all sitting at round tables. It was conversational. And yeah, it was very different. And there was no fire and brimstone. I would eventually be asked, like, hey, do you want to go through some leadership courses and lead a small group? I met one of my close friends at the time during that time period. And when I led a women's small group, I had like 5 or 6 women in that group who had either been divorced or also called off their wedding. And so it was
Wow.
interesting to see how God redeemed certain things, but also like, I don't know, it was a really good time. But I think that was what I needed for that time period. But then there was this whole other side of my life that was somewhat out of control, because I was kind of very still mad and hurt about my relationship and things that had happened in that relationship. And so part of it was also like, I knew I was never going to leave the church, but then I would also feel incredibly guilty for anything like drinking, dancing. I still would have that guilt, which is also crazy to say, because like one of the first people I dated actually when I lived on my own in Indianapolis um was not an upstanding citizen. I'll put it that way. He made money, lots of money, in ways that are not technically legal. So I like, there was no, and I never felt bad about that though. And that's funny to me. Like, it's weird to me to, I don't know.
This is
Anyway,
why.
yeah, go ahead.
This is why, though. This is why we're talking about the things we're talking about, because I will often use this hashtag do better church. And I mean that because I want the church to be a place where people can be themselves and be free, while also worshiping with other people that may or may not believe like them.
Yeah.
But that is the church. So I say all this to say all the stories we've been telling throughout this whole time point back to one common core idea, which is you can't come as you are to a church building, because there's all this stuff floating around in your head about, am I worthy to step into this place?
Mm-hmm.
Am I good enough? Am I actually going to be able to follow or be good enough to follow all of the things that they're asking me to follow? So only when a person is in a place of real, and how many of us ever are really there? Like, how many of us feel like we're ever in a spot where we're not struggling with at least one thing in our life? Like,
The intention. If the intention is, will I be accepted by these people?
Yeah.
Then we've already gotten it wrong. And that's why we're also saying you have to at least be strong in knowing who you are and what you believe.
Yeah.
I would say even before you do commit to becoming a member of a church someplace, or before you get deeply involved, because when you don't, it'll be formulated for you. Like, I'm a living testament to that. And I didn't even know it, right? Like, I knew I would speak on something, I would say a scripture or Bible verse, because I have studied the Bible. But that was all. I will say too, that experience, because I was also healing and very broken from a bad relationship with my ex-fiance. Like, I also will say that was the first time, and I would have been probably 25. Yeah. That was the first time that I actually was able to see God as a loving God. And it was also because my pastor's wife took me under her wing and mentored me. And she was like a second mom to me. And I'm forever grateful for that. She knows that to this day, because I had this picture of constantly living in fear, because I thought God was waiting to strike me down with lightning.
Right.
For dancing, for making out with somebody, for anything really, because that's just how my view had been formed. And it had been informed heavily in childhood by the Baptist church, not even necessarily putting that on our parents, right? And again, if you're watching or listening, grandma, grandpa, mom, dad, this is not a bash at anybody. This is just us processing our own faith, because at the end of the day, it's your faith ownership and your faith journey. Nobody can do that for you anyways. Now, if somebody else is judging you for that, that's on them, and they have to figure out why they're judging somebody else. But I digress. that was my first view into actually God as a loving God in that way, and that God wanted what was best for me. And that sounds crazy to say. To your point, in your wondering years, I was beginning my wondering years probably at the same exact time, but that's also when I got accepted into new leaders. And I would move to Chicago. I knew it was a God thing. I was 24 hours out from closing on a house in Indianapolis, and I pulled out, lost $1,000, which was huge for a really small teaching salary at the time. But I felt so strongly that day after meeting at a conference. I meet and find out about this organization called New Leaders that started out of Harvard. The only, again, hands-on learning principal experience you can have in the country. And they pay for your master's degree. And for me, it was impossible to think about affording a master's. And it wasn't until one of my students had said, Miss G, you should be the principal. I had never even thought about it. And so I was looking into programs. I'm like, well, Ball State is super expensive. I can't afford that. Like, it was really a matter of not financially, but it was like, again, one of those moments. It's like, don't do that yet. It's a year-long process, interviews. But I backed out of the house and I'm like, no, I'm going to go for it. And that was life-changing. But it also took that focus, just like you had the focus on your marriage and your kids. My focus was, I'm going to be the best damn school leader I can be. And that was my focus. I also knew I was going to get plugged into a church. So Chicago, you have lots of options. I attended, which, by the way, in Indianapolis, I also attended Eastern Star sometimes, which is a predominantly Black church where I had great experiences. They had revival usually every year. Like, I was able to have some really good experiences in Indianapolis on my own. I went to an all Spanish speaking church when I first moved to Chicago called El Mundo de Fe. And that was a great experience. But at some point I shifted. I went to another church, which I think you went with me. I think you guys actually came out for Easter one year or something.
Yeah. That was the one that was like a U shape or something. It seemed like it went like this around the pastor. I don't know. Go ahead.
Maybe at the time, we were in a really old building at the time. But yeah, that was also a great experience, but it was very charismatic. And so people would speak in tongues, people would be jumping up and down. When it was greeting time, you were going to hug people and kiss them on the cheeks, like large Latino population, very diverse church. And that was a great experience too. I made friends there. My first friends in Chicago when I moved there were really from the church. And I think they were affiliated actually with Assemblies of God. So again, I'm sharing this because you see, it's like a whole gamut of denominations. I've been to Joel Osteen's church. I've done a lot of things. I've tried a lot of different churches. And at the end of the day, ultimately, on my trajectory, my last position before I started a company, and I'm sharing this because it's an important part of this journey, I was still living in such a way that even if my pastor's wife in Indianapolis had given me a perspective of God, if I didn't continue working on that on my own, which I didn't, I still essentially reverted back to my typical way of thinking, if that makes sense.
Condemnation.
Condemnation, fear.
Yeah.
My MO with anything.
Yeah.
Lack mindset.
Yep.
Whatever it was about, and that sounds crazy because there was so much abundance in my life in so many ways, and God was providing these rich experiences. I lived pretty much throughout my teaching and leadership career. I lived in pretty much any neighborhood that I served in. That was just something I always wanted to do. So it wasn't a matter of feeling like I was disconnected from God or that I wasn't part of a church, but the depth of my relationship now compared with then is exponentially different. And I haven't really been part of a church or connected to one for probably a couple years. After I served in Chicago as an administrator, I got the opportunity to launch a high school, and it was within a model that was faith-based. And it was, again, great timing. It felt like God was opening this door. Got to go launch a campus in Indianapolis, then one in East Chicago. got promoted to serve over 10 schools. And so at the time, I'm thinking, oh, it's going to be the best thing since sliced bread. I have no reservations if a student wants me to pray with them, and all the things you aren't supposed to do in public schools. And I drink the Kool-Aid. But that was actually one of the most, if not the most damaging experience I've ever had in my career, but also to my faith, and not in a good way. In the sense of my faith, it woke me up to the perpetuation of legalism, the perpetuation of hatred, all cloaked in the name of Jesus. Mm-hmm. And just a few of the key highlights from that, and actually why I even left my position, there were two reasons. I had a major health scare. I'm laying at my government-assisted hospital in East Chicago because, of course, it was a ministry, so they didn't have quality insurance for us because we were just there to serve. I'm laying there crying because I had found a lump on my breast and thinking, God, I can't die like this. I'm burning myself out. I was much more overweight, like all these different things, when seemingly you're supposed to be on this spiritual high of ministry and also school leadership. When I find out on the back end, because you're just called to serve, everything will work out. I had already taken a massive pay cut, had way more years of experience, expertise, credentials, licensures, success than a lot of the males in this evangelical-led organization. Most were being paid $40,000 more than me. So, but we're called to serve. All in the name of Jesus. Another key factor, the reason ultimately why I resigned, I was asked to build a case against an employee because he was speaking about Black Lives Matter at family circle time with students. These are high school students.
And they were mostly Black. Am I wrong about that?
At that particular campus, it was definitely, I think, at least 60% Black, yeah. Even if they weren't. I had no issue with it. It was the election year at the time, and I really saw the evil come out. I heard things that were being said about me, and that I was liberal, that I was just some girl from the city. These aren't real school ideas. Like, I mean, there's a lot of things that I've not even told you, because at that moment, it was just, no, I'm out. You're not going to do this to me. You're not going to, I won't have blood on my hands. My problem with it was my ego told me, oh, I can have an influence. I can help them change. Maybe I will help them see the value of some of the people that I get to work with. Because at the end of the day, the person that they asked me to build a case against, because they didn't like he was talking about Black Lives Matter, they didn't like, that was one of my highest performing schools. So there were so many things that were wrong with it, and ethically, no. I was like, I'm out, I'm good. I mean, you remember, it was literally in a matter of 24 hours, and I sent my resignation letter.
Yep.
Didn't know what was going to happen, but that is ultimately because at that time I was also attending a mega church in Northwest Indiana, but I was attending not because I had the energy to be involved or the will to be involved, but because I thought that's what I have to do, because now I also work for a Christian organization. So even though I was exhausted, overweight, like all these things that are super unhealthy, and that truly, if you really unpack the Bible, it talks about, right? It's no different than people who become alcoholics or whatever the vice is. So I'm sharing all that to say it was not until probably 4 years ago for me that I truly started to step back and get on the balcony and go, what do I really believe about this? Because the treatment of people, not just me, I wasn't anything special, because mind you, they had multiple discrimination lawsuits, all these things. This is not the love of Christ. And then also examine, like, okay, but what if I wanted to, I don't know, what if the fact that in my mind I was thinking about, like, oh, how would they treat it if I got pregnant? Or things like that I started asking, how would they treat it if they knew that I went out and had a drink? And I thought, I don't personally have a problem with that.
Right.
Why would I allow somebody else to have so much control in my life when they're not God? And clearly the things they were doing
And they're also not,
and the way
they're
they
not
were
even
treating people was not
right.
God.
Bingo.
So that's when this all really, really started. I think it's easier to say too, and in us sharing this, like the wandering years, wandering, W-A-N-D, I think we all go through that. And I don't think there's necessarily a timeline that you can say like, yes, I'm done with my wandering years, like, or anything like that. Because even in all that, it wasn't like I wasn't spending time with God. It wasn't that, and I think it's also one of those things where, for me, because the Holy Spirit has always been very strong in my life, even when I'm wandering, I always felt I was operating in my gifts. So to me, my daily worship was being a school leader because I was serving in that way, similar to you being a nurse. So it is hard for me to understand when people compartmentalize and say like, oh, I sell insurance, but yeah, I'm really involved in my church. Like, I don't, for me, and not that you can't be God's light by selling insurance. That's not what I'm saying. I haven't ever separated the two. And I was just talking to one of my girlfriends about this. For us, it is normal. We get on the phone and we're praying and we're fired up and we're like, that's normal for us. We're unpacking the Dirty Rotten Church Kids podcast. We're talking about, this passage we read. We're talking about this book we read. That is an honor, I think, to be able to have that inner circle. So I also want to encourage people that if you don't have people where you feel comfortable, whether it's in the workplace or whatever, or you're not feeling that, again, examine. I think that's what spurred some of this on for each of us, because we're like, well, I think that's what's coming out in this pandemic. So to bring it full circle to what you started with, here's the dichotomy. And why people might be saying, well, why are they asking questions? Why don't they just go get involved with the church? Like, just leave it alone, because like the whole period of time before the pandemic, what would you hear at any church USA potentially that you would go to? Be the hands and feet of Jesus. The church is not a building. When like the church does not just happen on Sunday mornings, everyone. Go be the hands and feet of Jesus. But as soon as pandemic hits,
the biggest shit show,
churches can't meet in person. We need to be able to have community. We need to be able to be back together. Please lift the executive orders.
And then it gets twisted and we're putting people's lives in danger at this point because of some of the deeply held beliefs and opinions that have been perpetuated, not out of love or service or community, but out of selfishness.
Yeah. So what happened, right? What happened to always preaching that message that the church doesn't just happen on Sunday mornings?
No, you know what they preach right now?
Now it's so vital. Now it's so yeah, sorry.
You know what they're teaching right now? Shut your mouth. Shut your mouth, keep the peace.
It should be easier. You should be easier if you're okay with math. I'm kidding. No, but that's I guess kind of bringing it full circle to it doesn't, that's not, we've never sat and renounced our faith in God. We're not claiming agnosticism or atheism.
Not the least.
Not in the least.
You might not be able to call us Christians, but I think that we both call ourselves Christians. And if anybody asks me, I usually say, well, what do you want to call me?
Yeah. It's more of a point, I think, to understand that when you ask people that question. So if you're tuning in, if you really want to know that about somebody, ask yourself why it's important for you to know that. I'll just leave that there, because that is usually more on the person asking. Because I will say, even as much as I attended different churches and was deeply involved, years ago, I think even in my mid-20s, and it was probably a result of the church I attended most of my time in Indianapolis, I called myself either a believer or a follower of God or a follower of Christ. So it's actually been probably like a decade that I have not called myself a Christian, because I know that there's also triggering connotation for others who are not involved in a church. And I also had friends from different faith backgrounds. I have friends who are gay. We have family members who are gay. Like, there's certain things that as you start to realize, if that could be damaging to maybe your relationship with somebody, that's just how I started viewing it and looking at it. And I didn't want to have that connotation be negative or conservative, especially moving to Chicago from Indiana, which is well known to be super conservative. I wasn't trying to perpetuate that stereotype with myself, because I knew that my lived experiences were maybe not reflective of the populace of Indiana, quote unquote.
Well, let's talk briefly about conservative values, because we're not saying there's anything wrong with having conservative values.
No, I'm conservative on a lot of issues, and I don't. But I'm not saying that's a specific political party.
Right.
It's not what I'm saying.
What's wrong with conservatism, and when it intersects with Christianity or evangelical Christianity, and that's like an intersection,
right?
And you make it about political, like you're saying, and you make it that way,
right?
There is harm, because we're commanded to love as followers of God.
Right.
That is first and foremost what Jesus taught. And the red letters, if you look at the Bible and what he actually teaches about, those are the elements that he's like, I'm sitting here arguing all day with the rabbis. I'm Jewish and I'm going to argue with these rabbis. He's not a rabbi. Jesus was not a rabbi. He didn't have the training, but he's sitting there arguing with these groups of rabbis saying, this is bullshit. You're looking at the old letters of the law. I'm telling you, this is not what God is looking for. He wants close, deep, intimate, loving relationship with you. Bam, drop the mic. I'm out. And then he goes on his merry way to the next one. So in that sense, like, we have to look at what we're doing and how we're interacting with other people first and foremost as the body of Christ. Because if we're really claiming that, our conservative values, we can hold those in ourselves. We can hold those in our own homes and families, but you're not going to be putting those onto anybody else. You should not be, right? You should not be trying to convert people to your way of thinking, because you're just ultimately going to end up pushing people away from you. People feel when you're like, nope, I don't agree with you, so you just must not be who you say you are, and you're out. You're out. That's not love. We love people. We can still hold our belief, but we can love people in spite of our beliefs, because we have to fully know. Like Justine and I are perfect examples, which is why we're doing this series. We grew up in the same situation, but we hold different beliefs now. Like, theologically, we don't agree on some things. Like, there's a lot of different things in our lives that we don't, but we still love each other. We support each other. And me telling her, this is being a bad person, the Bible says this, is not going to be helpful or edifying for her. She knows what the Bible says. And actually, for a person who doesn't know what the Bible says, you know what that does? It makes them feel like
they don't want to study the Bible anymore.
I don't know anything about this God that they're talking about, and he sounds scary, so I'm out, So let's rethink like how we're treating and approaching people. If we're creating a space where we're intending fully to be a closed community, that's never a good idea. Okay? Never. I did want to read from 1 Corinthians, a couple chapters over from 1 Corinthians 11. We have the famous passage on love. So I don't know, are we ready to close out, or do you have more to say?
It pretty much has led us to where we are in our timeline and age right now, that we have discovered we were kind of in our wandering years the same period of time, and we're still deconstructing and everyday studying. And I think that's honestly, if you look at the lives and teachings of the disciples, that's also, not that we're likening ourselves to the disciples, but that is what they lived. They examined where they were visiting, where they were serving, and they unpacked and tried to demonstrate Jesus' teachings. That's it. And that it was not every single disciple thought the same way. Not every single disciple taught the same way, or had the same path in life or the same background. So it's a call to action for grace and understanding. And when we have these movements and churches and individuals who are not accepting, even though maybe you say, well, we love everyone, but you're not accepting in action and deed. We don't just mean in word. And you're also not actively sharing like your exploration and your journey of things. We share this because we're not perfect. Nobody's perfect. And there's also no point at which you arrive like, oh, okay, well, I've got it all together. God has saved me, and, I'm comfortable. And I think if you're living according to God in your life and serving, just like the Bible does say, I think that that's really hard. I think that that's really hard. From a human perspective. And I think sometimes in general, especially the evangelical church in the United States, they make it sound very simple. And I think that that's an unjust disservice to the Bible and Jesus' teachings, because that path of giving yourself to God truly is not easy a lot of times. It's not favorable. It's not the most popular.
I would disagree. I think the church makes it hard. I think they make it hard because Jesus said, come you who are weary, and I will give you rest. Love God, love others. And we make it complicated in the church for people to come as they are. We don't allow people to come as they are. And so how would they obtain that rest, that spiritual rest in God that Jesus is talking about? I don't think the church makes it sound easy. I think they make it sound complicated for me, because I feel like there's a million things I have to do to even cross the threshold of a church.
They make it hard from their own rules they created.
Right.
When I say it's harder than what they make it based on scripture, usually a Sunday sermon at this point is 1 or 2 verses that are pulled out of context and not taught completely and wholly. There are definitely pastors who do, don't get me wrong. T.D. Jakes is one of them. If you ever watch his sermons, reads within the whole context of a passage or chapter and breaks that apart very, very well. But I say that because human nature wants relationships to be easy. And so to really love other people, to really understand and know other people, that requires effort, and that does require time and hard work.
Oh, you're right.
And it also requires being vulnerable. So, I mean, you just saw it firsthand how, hey, audience, you saw it firsthand how we could have like had a massive disagreement and like parted ways forever because she automatically, no, I'm serious though. I'm actually being really serious. But these are the conversations that if you're not willing to invest that time because you just don't even really care to hear, like I heard Kara out. And I heard her out because I figured that's what she was going to say. And I could have been proven wrong. Who knows? But had I just left it at that, I would have gone, yeah, no, we disagree. I didn't, because I knew why I believed and said what I said.
Right.
So when you see people type that right now, I said what I said. I see a lot of people put that on their social media posts right now. But do you know why you said what you said?
My opinion, my page. Get out.
What is that? Wait, my opinion, my page. Mom?
My page, my opinion.
I wish it could be like MoPo, like FOMO.
Oh,
my opinion,
I like that.
Perspective, my own. MoPo.
There you go.
No, but that's the piece, right? It took 2 extra minutes in our conversation. But that's what the question is you have to ask yourself. That's the hard part of loving like Jesus did, because he really loved with compassion, and that required his time, it required his talents, it required his service, and it required him to sit truly with prostitutes and tax collectors and criminals and people who we already look at and judge and often condemn.
He was in his element with those people, and we are those people. We're all those people. So I wanted to talk briefly, real quick, about opinion and belief. So I found something interesting in the very definition. So opinions or beliefs can only be true if they can only be true or false if they're based on the assertions that are based in truth. So if you don't even know, like, your belief or opinion is not truth. What we're sitting here telling you is truth to us for right now. Right. But if there's another assertion that comes along down the road that shows us evidence of something contrary to what we formerly believed, which is why it's important to keep your mind flexible and not see everything in black and white, which we've been trained to try to see everything as right or wrong, this or that, binary thinking. Your opinions are only arrived upon by the amount of work you've done to build them up. Really, if you're a person that looks at something and is like, yeah, I like that person, so I'm going to agree with what they're saying, but you actually never did the work to think about what they're actually saying, or you're part of this kind of political movement and your party says XYZ about whatever. And you're like, well, I'm part of this party and this is what my party says, so this is what I say, but you've never actually given the time or energy to think about what they're actually saying and the implications for other groups of people. That is not, that's your opinion, but don't say your opinion is like truth. Like, just because you have an opinion doesn't mean it is the truth. I just wanted to differentiate.
Unless you have a stats background and have conducted multiple studies with sample sizes that are conducive to testing a hypothesis, and you have data to back it up and validity, you don't actually have data or evidence of something. You know what I mean? Well, like, I'm saying that from a PhD perspective, like from a social science perspective, if you wanted to make the claim of something, minimum, you would need to survey multiple groups of people, have control groups, and actually have input from multiple representative stakeholders to be able to definitively say, yes, I did a study regarding Christian evangelicals in the United States, and here were the findings. So until it's at that point, you can't say, right now, based on the data we have, this is what we know to be true.
Right.
And this is why. But not that most people are going to want to do that. I'm just saying from a
the problem is there are clear lines of evidence that go with certain ideologies.
Yeah.
And the end treatment of people on the other side of those ideologies. But if you only will look at the ideology itself and you never explore the impact that it has down the road,
yep,
for people, including yourself at times, then there's no validity to your opinion. Like, you don't get to say your opinion and say, it's my opinion. And I get to say, you can say it, but really, to me, when I see a person that won't have a conversation about their belief or opinion, it just means that you haven't done the work. You don't know, so you're just gonna say it's your opinion.
Well, an opinion is, you bring up a good point. Language is important because an opinion isn't necessarily a belief. And so there's two other layers I'm gonna add from a psychological standpoint. Opinion, beliefs, opinions, beliefs, thoughts, and emotions. They're 4 separate things.
And truth is a whole separate thing from that.
Correct. So my encouragement would be, let's use an example. Say that you have a clear belief about how people should enter the United States to become citizens. Okay. You get all riled up and excited because you hear the current president speaking about building a wall. You need to stop right there and ask yourself, wow, why is this resonating with me? Do I really believe in the intention? Do I understand all the aspects of what building a wall would do? And have I examined why I believe what I believe about my stance? If you haven't done those things, then I would stop and just ask yourself to sit alone with yourself and go, man, I heard his speech and I got all excited. I'm using this as an example. It's not my own belief, just a disclaimer. But it's a common example that people are very divided on, is immigration in general. If I don't stop there and go, yeah, I'm fired up. Yeah, what he said. Why? Why are you fired up? Do you actually believe it's wrong for people fleeing rape and murder to have a safe place? Do you actually know all the different perspectives? Do you actually know what's happening in detention centers?
Do you actually think it's okay? You know, we have a lot of cognitive dissonance going on right now with people who believe that it's wrong to abort babies, but in turn won't say it's wrong to keep kids in cages. That's cognitive dissonance, meaning you believe in the sanctity of one life, but you are not here to protect the sanctity of another life.
So full circle, go back, get your sources, but number one source. If you claim to be a Christian, if you claim to follow Christ, if you claim to follow God, if you claim to study the Bible, go show me the chapter and verse where it talks about immigrants in the United States. Oh, because pretty sure it didn't exist when the Bible was translated. What verse tells us and who tells us how we should treat immigrants?
Look at who's talking. Look at who's telling you what they're telling you. This includes inside the church, outside the church, political realm, educational realm, whoever.
I don't know. Kara, do you, again, and this is fiery because election is upon us, people are supercharged. Remind me, does the Bible talk about Republicans and Democrats?
Well, let me look up in my index here.
I'm getting cheeky now, and I need to stop.
I don't find that anywhere, but you never know, okay? Give Caesar's what is Caesar's.
Caesar. So, do you think Caesar was big or small as a man?
I think he was very tiny.
So do I, and that's why Little Caesars is named Little Caesar's Pizza. I think he had little man syndrome. Okay, let me stop. So I say all that to say with those examples because I'm trying to model how we also started asking questions about different things in the Bible, just like going back to your 21, 22-year-old self when you said, wait a minute, but if the Bible says this about a woman covering her head, then why aren't we doing that? And why wasn't I raised to do that? It all started with one question. And you get better at starting to ask yourself those questions. It's kind of like if I put on, you know how they have like the sunglasses that have yellow lenses or pink lenses. If I put those on, how do I see the world? It's in yellow or pink. So once you start to ask those questions, once you put on those glasses of like getting inside your own head and establishing your own truth, I keep calling it faith ownership because I think that that's really, really vital and really important to the process of when you deconstruct your own faith. And further, that ties into deconstructing your own beliefs, whether they are about systemic racism, COVID-19, whatever global issue, voting, etc. But you have to start asking yourself. Don't play the victim, because I will also say, as we were reflecting on this journey right now and where we find ourselves and why we're so passionate about the things we talk about, it's because even during those wandering years, we were still sitting there asking ourselves questions and sitting in it every day. And mine was, why am I selling my soul for turning around schools?
Right.
And I know every kid is worth it. Every adult is worth it. Every community is worth that. But God also never told me to kill myself doing that.
Right.
And there was an issue. What was uncovered for me in those wandering years was there were some major self-worth issues. And I treated other people actually in a lot of situations way better than I actually loved and treated myself, which means that I really couldn't even love and treat them as good as I could because I didn't even see myself that way.
We have to get to a place, if we ever hope to not be in distress as a society, we have to start thinking this way. We have to start critically thinking, because I think if we sat in a room with people who we would right now at the outset say, I fundamentally know from what this person shares about that I disagree with where they're coming from. I think if we could sit in a room and chat for a few hours and break some of these barriers down, we could land in a similar zone, right? Like maybe we don't actually, it's like the Venn diagram, like where can we overlap and come together, and actually we end up seeing like these outlier things that like maybe we can't come to an agreement on, we can't see eye to eye on,
but they become a speck. They become a little speck of dust.
Right.
And this is exactly why my field of study is cultural psychology and cultural neuroscience, and why I do what I do through my other company. Because at the end of the day, unless you create that table for people to sit down and talk, a lot of us aren't willing to do that. And a lot of us, it feels very uncomfortable and very unsafe. And all we can think about is, but you did this one time, or you said this one time, and I know you're a bad person because X, Y, Z. And we start already categorizing people just like humans like to do, instead of just having a conversation, because ultimately the common thread is the human experience. And if I have the capacity and invest the time and effort to actually see the value of the human being sitting across from me.
Right.
And until we decide to do that without the labels, without saying, oh, well, they're a Muslim, I'll never agree with them, I'm not going to hang out with them.
Do I have the strength within my being to ask a question to myself? Like I remember years past, I would think of things like weird stuff in the Bible that I was puzzled by, but I'd immediately go,
like the book Song of Solomon.
Yeah, pretty rich guy. Y'all been following Cardi B these days. It's not much different than her current song that she has out, but
he likes to get down.
But if you don't feel comfortable even asking questions, like if you cut it off in your brain, we can't move forward.
And that's the neural path. That's the science part. I won't get too deep, but that is, your brain creates neural paths.
Yeah.
And that's the neural path that's been ingrained. So unless you intentionally work to remap your neural paths and create new ones, that's going to be your knee jerk. If your knee jerk has been judging people who look or sound or say they believe this way, that is your neural path. And so unless you actively do that for yourself, nobody's going to do that for you. The church ain't going to do it. Reading your Bible every day ain't going to do it necessarily. I'm just saying. Right. Because you also have to know how to ask yourself those questions when you're reading the Bible, instead of,
how does this look in my life?
This is why it wasn't active for me. This is another epiphany moment. I could tell you I picked this up like every day, or I read my Bible, or I did a devotional, but I was reading it through the same neural path since I was 6 years old.
Yeah. From the brain of a child.
How would I really think differently? How would I really translate beliefs about certain issues differently? I would, well, unless you have then lived experiences and you have diverse groups of friends and you've lived different places, or like Kara, you've lived in other countries, you at least have some help But even despite all of that, we're saying that as people who have lived in contexts where we're the only of something and we stick out like a sore thumb. Even that, we still hadn't created completely new neural paths.
Well, that, and you gotta, there's an element of permission there that you
Right.
have to give yourself.
Right.
The church is not going to give it to you, and likely, I don't know, it depends on which church you're part of, who your leaders are, all that stuff. But likely, these are the questions that are going to bring deep discomfort in that scenario. But it's still okay and necessary for you to ask the question.
Don't allow yourself to knee jerk and just say, well, I believe this because the Bible says it.
It's not love. That's not love. You're not even close to being on the path to loving other people if you can't even ask a question in your brain because of some kind of stigma you think is associated with not believing.
Right.
I'm going to read about love because this is what the Bible says about love. And we all need to hear this. And this is actually what Paul says about love, who also wrote about women wearing head coverings and the headship. And so this is the man that really, go ahead.
Caveat with Paul, if you don't know, Paul's profession before he converted to spreading Christianity was literally to execute Christians. Paul was not a disciple. Yeah. A lot of people don't know that.
Here we go. 1 Corinthians chapter 13. I'm going to read the whole dang thing because it's all
wasn't important. This read at your wedding?
I don't remember.
Why did you make that face?
I don't know what face did I make.
You were like, I don't want to talk about it.
No, I really don't remember. I'm
pretty sure it was. I was your maid of honor.
I was mourning sick on my wedding. You were
about 4 months pregnant.
4 months
you still
pregnant.
Look fabulous. So.
And also, I mean, it's a beautiful occasion, but I remember very little of it just because I was like, I was just, yeah, it was
many emotions. So many
emotions. But okay, 1 Corinthians chapter 13 on love by the Apostle Paul. And now I will show you the most excellent way is how he starts this chapter. The most excellent way.
Totally excellent, dude. I'm sorry.
That's what I was thinking. If I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I am only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy and can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have a faith that can move mountains, but I have not love, I am nothing. If I give all I possess to the poor and surrender my body to the flames, but have not love, I gain nothing. Love is patient. Love is kind. It does not envy. It does not boast. It is not proud. It is not rude. It is not self-seeking. It is not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. The truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. Love never fails. But where there are prophecies, they will cease. Where there are tongues, they will be stilled. Where there is knowledge, it will pass away. For we know in part and we prophesy in part. We know in part and we prophesy in part. We don't never know the whole thing, is what he's saying there. But when perfection comes, the imperfect disappears. When I was a child, I talked like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became a man/woman, I added that one. I put childish ways behind me. I.e., I learned to reason like a man/woman. Now we see but a poor reflection as in a mirror. Then we shall see face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I am fully known. Even as I am fully known, meaning I'm fully known by God, I will eventually know but right now I'm fully known and I can rest in that love.
Right.
And now these three remain: faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love. Written by the man that murdered Christians and heard the message of Jesus so powerful that the God of love needed him to impart on the world, that even he was able to be inspired by the message of Christ. Let's be inspired. Let's be like actually inspired people. You don't have to be one of the disciples or one of the apostles or whatever you want to, like any of the people that followed Christ back in the day. We can be those on the hands, or we can be the hands and feet of Christ today.
If you're an artist or a photographer, do your work through inspiration of God. Like, that's the thing. I think people want to put their gifts and talents into a box or separate it out from maybe their spiritual walk or the church they're involved in on the weekends or throughout the week. And it's not meant to be separated. You hear it in the very first line. If I speak in the tongues of men and of angels. So even people who are divinely inspired and prophesying, but you don't you have the absence of love, you are a clanging gong or cymbal. And again, you can say what you want about Paul's teachings or who he was or his struggles, but to have somebody who was so called and has such an experience that he went from literally as a job, his job was to execute and kill Christians. And then he has a 180 experience. And in his world, in his context, this is what he knew to be true. So if I speak in the tongues of men, i.e. mega churches, if you're trying to have backup dancers and lights, camera, action, it's a concert every time. There ain't nothing wrong with trying to be culturally relevant. Don't get me wrong. But you're speaking in the
be relevant in the way that it's important.
You're speaking in the tongues of men. And at the end of the day, people want to know more about the character of Christ, of the Christ and of God. And so when you elevate yourself to be like this super hip, cool pastor, or we're a super hip, cool church, and it's about that facade, you're not focused on the likeness of God. You're not focused on the image of the Christ. So I think that is what gets lost. And that is why when people are going to church seeking love, especially for Gen X, especially for millennials, Gen Y, and especially for Gen Z, they are not feeling connected because there is no connection. You give me a spiritual high or mountaintop experience, but you haven't taught me how to think. So going back to those 4 layers, opinions, beliefs, emotions, and thoughts are 4 different things. You might make me emotionally feel really good. And I go, yeah. But I still don't know shit about why I believe what I believe. And furthermore, if you really unpack what Paul wrote, you would have to actually understand what love means and how good love can be and what type of love God shows us. And for some people, they equate love with like, oh, you always take care of me, or oh, you always say these things about me. So it brings up a whole other conversation that if you haven't experienced unconditional love in your life, then you have no option but to uphold it through legalism, because it's I love you if you do X, Y, Z.
Amen.
I feel like that's a whole other series on actually how do we see love, how do we experience in our lives, because I also think that that's another pandemic, so to speak, as to why people say, well, this is why we have 50% divorce rate. I don't think that a lot of us really comprehend what love is.
No.
And it's based off of how we thought when we were a child, how we were treated when we were a child.
Right.
And that could be filled with good experiences, and it could be filled with not so great experiences. But if you don't start with yourself and just asking the question, why do I believe this? Then you'll stay stuck as to those neuropaths that were likely created through your childhood experiences, through your teenage years. And this, I will also say, it's even harder to do. Like, I would say both of us in our own respective had some radical experiences in our lives, whether it's been through travels, whether it's been through where we've lived or how we've served. Even if you're a person who you're like, well, shoot, I've lived in the same town my whole life or whatever, I would also argue it's okay if you feel really, really overwhelmed or like scared to even start asking yourself these questions. I would challenge that it might even be harder for that person because you don't really have a reason to disrupt the status quo right now if your life is really comfortable. And that's why this can also feel off-putting. Like, why would I want to disrupt that? I've got 2.5 kids, a white picket fence. I own my home. I get to stay at home. My husband works. I'm just filling in the blanks of like a lot of Midwest, particularly Midwest scenarios, especially for women. And so it can feel jarring to be like, why would I disrupt this Eden of paradise? And even if it's not paradise or you're deeply discontent, you're like, why would I want to disrupt this? I have a pretty comfortable life.
I can tell you why, because your children will not have a comfortable life if you don't ask yourself these questions. Because get real radical and know and trust your children will not have this picket fence life that you want for them if you don't ask yourself these radical questions, because they're going to grow up in a world that don't know how to love anybody. We don't want that. Do we, church? I mean, Justine.
No. We are all the church.
We are all the church.
All right. Well, we're going to close it out. I have no clue how long this actually was. Ooh, probably close to 3 hours. Who knows? No, probably like 2, at least a solid 2. But even if you had to break this apart, please feel free, drop comments, reach out to us. Kara's at Fawn River Beauty on Instagram. I'm at Justine, I'm at Spiritually Strategic. We have a combined page at Spiritually Strategic _co. And of course, we have our YouTube channel here as well. So just sharing vulnerably and learning as we go. So we're on the journey.
We will be creating a private Facebook group in the near future. So be looking out for that. I don't know if we'll have it created by the time that we put the show out, where that's the goal, but be looking for that. If you want a safe space to come and have conversation with like-minded people. I know social media. I've been posting a lot on my personal socials lately about some of my faith journey, and while some of it doesn't garner a whole lot of response visually online, I have been getting a ton of private messages from people because of the nature of this. This is really, and we know this too, being part of the church in the past, like you don't want a certain stigma as somebody that's searching or looking outside of your faith zone. So we know that stigma. We appreciate all of you guys that reach out privately. You are heard, you are loved. We want to be there for people that are willing to ask the first question, and not that we're claiming to be experts on theology of any stretch of the imagination. We're sharing with you what we're going through currently. But we do want women to have a safe space to gather and be able to ask each other questions. That will not be a space where we're going to invite like proselytizing, meaning don't come in there and sling Bible verses around at people, telling them why they're wrong about what they're thinking about. That's not the intention. It's simply like a space to be supportive of one another and share with one another what we're learning, basically.
Ask questions.
It will be like highly. It will be.
I would also say are like all walks, right? So faith,
all walks,
not just deconstruction is not just Christianity. Faith deconstruction could be if you're Muslim or Jewish. Could be if you're atheist and you're like, well, this is what I've always thought, and I don't think God is real. Our disclaimer is that we want a safe place for people to ask questions and really own their faith journey without judgment. period.
Right.
Because we know how important that is to us and the sisterhood that we get to have biologically and also in respect of the concept. And we've had people reach out and say, wow, that's amazing what y'all are doing. But we don't want it to just be amazing for us. We're sharing it publicly because it's healing for us, but it's also a challenge for us, right? Like we're putting ourselves out there and we're, we've gotten backlash from people who have seemingly known and loved us for years. And we're okay with that. We're both completely content and at peace with that.
Yeah, because there's a difference, like in the old way of my thinking, trying to bring somebody to my belief was always the objective.
Right.
And now I want you to have your own belief. Like I really, truly, because God has placed in each of us something different. And I truly believe that. And so for me to try to say like, oh, you should believe this doesn't even make sense anymore. Just on
I just shared with the superintendent a few days ago as we were talking, and he was just talking to me about some of the challenges and struggles right now in his district. And I said, look, the only person you have to be okay with your decision making about at the end of the day is ultimately yourself and your belief and why you're making those decisions. Because you're your only person, even if you have a family of kids. I'm not saying that they don't matter. If you lead in a school district, obviously you have lots of people that matter, lots of little human beings. But at the end of the day, if you know why you're making your decision, the main person you're going to answer to is God. And you have to look at your own reflection in the mirror and be okay with the decision you make. So if you haven't taken time to understand why you're making your decision, then it's a problem. Because again, I think it's Peter who says, always be prepared to give a reason or an answer as to why you believe what you believe. He was talking about knowing why you believe what you believe. And it's the same.
And it can't be because the Bible says. It can't be because the church says.
That's right. And that's what I told my friend who's a superintendent. I said, look, just because this was a mandate in another district doesn't mean that that's what's right or best for your district. If you know your people, you love your people, you know your community, you love your community, and you're operating out of your ethical compass based on God and his love in your life, there's no apology to make for your decision making, because you've also been placed in a role of leadership. You have a freaking PhD too. So if you're comfortable and at peace, and you've sought out God, and this is a guy who, former pastor even, so we talk about God too, even in our partnership to serve his district. You just have to be okay with it. That's all. So at the end of the day, when you like anybody out there, and with us too, at the end of the day, when I lay my head on my pillow, I just have to know that me and God, we're good with that decision making and how I live my life.
Yeah.
And in alignment with the teachings of the Bible. For me, that's what I believe.
Same.
And we won't go into why right now. Okay, we've modeled that. We believe you need to know why. But that would just be too long right now. We can do it again if you'd like. Okay. I guess we've deconstructed. We hope that you enjoy all the episodes. Again, we did them blindly. We have not viewed one another's for the most part. Kara looked at one of mine. But start with episode 1. We hope you enjoyed this series. Bye, sister.
Bye, sister.